What amazing times we live in, here in these United States of America. From a union of independent republics, our nation has evolved into a technological superstate. We are surrounded by the artifacts of tremendous wealth. Multinational corporations, international banking groups, media conglomerates, and the super rich have built gleaming urban centers solely for the private accounting of huge sums of money. Technology and commerce advance at a breathtaking pace. Yet, out of the gleaming towers, on the home front for small businesses and hard-working individuals, the people who comprise the majority of Americans, the reality today is that we face a crisis in our economy, a crisis that has undermined the very principles upon which our nation was founded. We are faced with a gigantic national debt, portending a future of ever-increasing taxes, and we are in this position because of a massive fraud that has been perpetrated upon the American people, a fraud that is robbing us of our wealth, condemning our children to the tyranny of perpetual debt, and making a mockery of the principles for which so many Americans have given their lives in armed conflict with tyrants. The fraud that threatens our heritage is institutionalized in the Federal Reserve banking and income tax system. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned corporation that currently has greater immediate power to influence the standard of living of individual Americans than Congress or the President. And this private corporation operates outside the checks and balances on government established by the Constitution. These are, without question, bold statements, but we implore you to listen carefully to all of the evidence we will present here and use it as a basis for your own investigation. Today, millions of concerned Americans are heeding the warnings of our founding fathers to be vigilant of tyrants masquerading as public servants. The people are educating themselves and sharing information about the ways our Constitution and our rights have been abridged, and how we have been duped into accepting what amounts to a statutory slavery imposed by Congress. Additionally, there are scores of educational organizations across the country dedicated to exposing the truth, helping to educate Americans about their fundamental rights as a free and sovereign people. These organizations have helped hundreds of thousands of Americans teach themselves the distinction between civil and unalienable rights, between federal and state citizenship, between the republic for which we stand and the legislative democracy Congress has imposed on the states. These citizen organizations have also helped thousands of individuals reestablish their sovereign status and legally free themselves from the fraudulent federal and state income tax system. These are not tax protesters, but patriotic Americans who firmly believe in paying any lawful and constitutionally imposed taxes to support our nation. Like our founders, these sovereign Americans believe that labor is the most sacred property of a free people, and as such, cannot be taxed. To quote the courts, the individual, unlike the corporation, cannot be taxed for the mere privilege of existing. The corporation is an artificial entity which owes its existence and charter powers to the state, but the individual's rights to live and own property are natural rights, for the enjoyment of which an excise cannot be imposed. Because of official deceit, constructive fraud, and concealment of facts, millions of Americans, fed up with confiscatory taxes and the Gestapo-like tactics of the Internal Revenue Service, have become non-filers and are protesting the income tax statutes at criminal risk. It is our sincere desire that all Americans will become educated about how to lawfully regain their sovereign status, and that together we can boot the special money interests out of our government again. But we must know the laws and procedure and work in alignment to restore the constitutional limits on government that protect liberty. Only then will the wealth of our nation be returned to the people to whom it belongs, and the blessings of freedom preserved for our posterity. More than 200 years ago, our forefathers gave their hearts, their fortunes, and their lives to ensure the blessings of liberty for all future generations. They were well acquainted with how big money interests had taken control of Europe, and they designed our Constitution to keep control of the economy in the hands of the people. They did this by ensuring the sovereignty of individuals. First, by limiting the power of the central government through the original Constitution as ratified in 1788, and by insisting that our money be made of real substance like gold and silver coin. Second, through the Bill of Rights as an absolute bar to any infringement of our natural and civil rights. And third, by providing that decisions on the validity of any laws would ultimately rest with the people through common law actions and the established right of the citizen jury to decide both the facts and the law in any controversy. Today in America, each of these fundamental protections has been violated. The result is official corruption, widespread poverty, economic chaos, a failing educational system, social discontent, and a criminal justice system at war with the people it is sworn to serve. Many Americans have come to accept the conventional wisdom that these problems are simply the result of the complexities of modern times, that there is no real solution, and that the only answers are more taxes, more government, more prisons, more police, and more sacrifice on the part of the American people. That is not true. What is happening in America today has happened throughout the ages as tyrants slowly work to convert great republics built upon the power of law into despotic empires that depend on force and coercion and spend more time meddling in other nations' affairs than dealing with their responsibility to protect liberty at home. Our founders were students of history, and they designed the Constitution for the United States of America to guard against such encroachment. But the tyrants eventually uncovered a flaw. It is precisely located in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. The clause reads, "Congress shall have the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district as may, by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings." Clear enough. The Constitution remains as a limitation on the federal government's authority in the states, while Congress is permitted to make all laws governing the territories and property under its jurisdiction. But in the years following the Civil War, the 39th and 40th Congresses perverted the intention of the language, such that the municipal government based in Washington, D.C., has come to control virtually every political, social, and geographical subdivision of the individual states, effectively destroying their sovereignty and literally converting their citizens into federal subjects. Prior to the 1930s, the United States of America was rarely referred to as a democracy. Our founders and many subsequent generations knew that our union used some democratic principles, but that we live in a great republic, not a democracy. For confirmation of this, just read the Constitution or recite the Pledge of Allegiance to yourself. In a republic, every individual is recognized to have certain absolute rights. The sole purpose of government is to secure those rights. In a democracy, individuals are dissolved into the body politic and are granted rights which vary according to the will of the majority. Our politicians love to keep drumming into the American consciousness that the United States today is a democracy, but that democracy is nothing more than a smoke and mirror show to fool free individuals into trading their rights for privileges. How did this happen? As with any other story of corruption, it's wise to start by following the money trail. First, remember that the founding of this nation began in a dispute over who would control the issue of money and taxation in America. Our forefathers rebelled against unlawful taxation imposed upon them. They risked imprisonment and death to free us from the yoke of European bankers. And in the end, they won our freedom. But there are many other ways besides armed conflict to wage war against a nation. To quote the English economist John Maynard Keynes, Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. The second battle in the money war was waged during the first years of our nation over the question of the establishment of a Bank of the United States. Alexander Hamilton, a friend of the international banking community, sponsored legislation to create a central bank. He argued that although privately owned and not authorized by the Constitution, the bank would work in partnership with government to facilitate control of the economy. Thomas Jefferson argued that central control of the money supply would lead to a dictatorship by those few with their hands on that control, and their greed would eventually plunge this country into perpetual debt. That debt is now upon us. It increases each day by $1.25 billion. Today, it stands at more than $4 trillion. That's at least $16,000 for every single person in the United States today. That's a debt our children already owe. Listen to Jefferson's warning from his debates with Hamilton in 1791.
I place economy among the first and foremost of virtues, and public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared. To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. If we run into such debts, we must be taxed in our meat, in our drink, in our necessities, and in our comforts, in our labor, and in our amusements. If we can prevent the government from wasting the labor of the people under the pretense of caring for them, they will be happy.
Imagine what Jefferson would say if he could be here today. Despite his eloquent arguments against a central bank, Thomas Jefferson eventually lost out in his battle to protect the rights of the people, and a Bank of the United States was established in 1791. But the people who experienced the imposition of paper money during the Revolution were vigilant. They could see through the bankers' self-interest, and they refused to allow Congress to renew the bank's charter after 1811. The people have, over the years, refused many attempts by the bankers to impose national tyranny through a central bank. But the international money interests have been relentless, and in the years following the Civil War, they hatched a sinister plot that, by 1913, led to the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank and the unlawful adoption of the 16th Amendment, the so-called Income Tax Amendment. The money interests also used technicalities embedded in another unlawfully adopted amendment, the 14th, to establish a federal debt that cannot be questioned, and to dupe all Americans out of their heritage as a free and sovereign people. Before we provide evidence connecting the loss of personal sovereignty to our current economic crisis, let's take a closer look at the banking and currency system. We'll start by listening to what historical and modern leaders have said about the creation of a central bank and our current Federal Reserve System. We'll ask President Thomas Jefferson to speak first.
If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property, until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered.
President James Garfield.
Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is master of all its legislation and commerce.
Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., commenting on the Federal Reserve Act of 1913.
This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized. The new law will create inflation whenever the trust wants inflation. From now on, depression will be scientifically created.
Henry Ford Sr., inventor of the automobile assembly line.
It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning.
Congressman Louis T. McFadden, former chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee.
The Federal Reserve and its member banks are not government institutions. They are private monopolies which prey upon the people of these United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign customers. Every effort has been made by the Fed to conceal its powers, but the truth is the Fed has usurped the government. It controls everything here in Congress, and it controls all our foreign relations. It makes and breaks governments at will.
And in this year, Congressman Henry B. Gonzalez, current chairman of the House Committee on Banking, Finance, and Urban Affairs, wrote into the Federal Reserve Accountability Act of 1993 that there is no question that the Fed runs our nation's monetary policy because it has complete and final governmental authority to manage the United States money supply. The American public should know that of the Federal Reserve System member banks that vote for Reserve Bank directors, approximately 60 banks with $130 billion in assets are foreign-owned. In the New York Federal Reserve District, 33% of the medium-sized member banks and 25% of the large member banks are foreign-owned. In the Federal Reserve System, the international money trusts have institutionalized their use of the central bank to gamble with our future, and they use the Internal Revenue Service to bully us into paying for their mistakes. One of the most outrageous ways the Fed abuses our money supply today is a process called fractional reserve banking. The fractional banking method allows any bank to declare a fraction, currently 10% of the amount of paper money credits received from depositors as their reserve, and loan out the balance at risk and at interest. This is called fractional reserve banking, and member banks are allowed to do this even if the paper money deposit was just borrowed from another bank. This allows the Federal Reserve System to create credit money out of thin air with the tap of a computer keyboard. This outrageously fraudulent process has been taking place since 1916, when the Fed first opened its doors. The original arguments in favor of central control of the money supply hinged on the potential ability of a central bank to maintain stability in the economy. But since the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson in 1913, we have had the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression, 9 recessions, and the national debt has risen from about $1 billion when the Fed first opened its doors to more than 4 trillion paper dollars today. To provide other international bankers with security on the worthless debt money the Fed moves around, it is necessary to exploit a constant source of real value. Your labor is that constant source of real value, collected through the income tax. And along with the graduated income tax comes the Internal Revenue Service, an organization that routinely violates your constitutional rights to privacy and fair treatment, and delivers every cent it collects directly to the Federal Reserve banks, bypassing the lawful U.S. Treasury. Your paper tax dollars only plunge the government deeper into debt, because the only way the Treasury can gain release of those captive dollars is by selling an equivalent amount of bonds to the Fed, bonds on which all taxpayers must pay interest. The only way to bring back truth in money is through real money, based on real substance, such as money coined from precious metals. But until we get back to a lawful money system, what can individuals do to break free of the fraudulent Federal Reserve System? The steps to recover our natural rights are discovery, realization, and proper assertion. You will discover in this presentation, perhaps to your astonishment, that the Internal Revenue Service has no external jurisdiction within the 50 states, but is limited by the Constitution solely to the 63 square miles of the District of Columbia and federal possessions like Guam and Puerto Rico. you will discover that the term United States has three legal meanings, and that, by law, one of the three entities called the United States is actually a foreign country to the 50 states united, and that although the people of the states have given this municipal corporation limited jurisdiction over their states, it has no paramount legal jurisdiction over the individual citizens of the 50 states, except by individual voluntary application and contract. You will discover that there are two classes of citizenship in this country, one based on the liberty secured by the Constitution, the other a form of feudal slavery imposed by contract. And we'll tell you right now that the primary contract used to steal your heritage is the application for a Social Security number. Once you understand the issues of jurisdiction, rights, and citizenship, we will introduce you to the general procedures necessary to properly assert your lawful sovereign status over government and free yourself from federal slavery. First, let's continue our examination of America's income tax history. Each year, the IRS and the Fed fraudulently take possession of billions upon billions of dollars of Americans' wealth, often harassing and even imprisoning those who refuse to comply with the terms of their fraudulent contracts. The special interests who control these institutions have used misleading information, complex statutory laws, and intimidation to scare us into thinking we are powerless to stop this fraud. The process that got us into this mess has taken place over several generations and has been institutionalized to the point that we take it for granted that we should all pay wage taxes to the federal government on our natural right to make a living. But that simply is not true. It is a lie that has been slowly and systematically woven into the fabric of our society by the money interests who would enslave our nation and our children to enrich themselves. That our labor is our property and a natural, inalienable right has clearly been established in the courts. In the case of Butchers Union Company versus Crescent City, the court said, "The property which every man has is his own labor. As it is the original foundation of all other property, so it is the most sacred and inviolable. The patrimony of the poor man lies in the strength and dexterity of his own hands, and to hinder his employing this strength and dexterity in what manner he thinks proper, without injury to his neighbor, is a plain violation of this most sacred property." If the government is allowed to place a tax on a natural right, it can then raise that tax to the point where that right has effectively been destroyed. That is tyranny. But you may say the IRS collects taxes on income and says it has been empowered to collect a tax on incomes from whatever source derived by the 16th Amendment. That may be true, but it has nothing to do with your wages. Here are the facts. People who work for a living are compensated in the form of wages. Wages are not income. They are compensation for labor, which, as the courts have affirmed, is property protected as a natural right. Income is an accounting profit or gain that can be derived from investing your wages. But don't expect the IRS to point this out for you. For a legal opinion, it's always better to turn to the courts. For instance, in the case of Oliver versus Halstead from 1955, the court ruled there is a clear distinction between profit and wages, or compensation for labor. Compensation for labor cannot be regarded as profit within the meaning of the law. The word profit, as ordinarily used, means the gain upon any business or investment, a different thing altogether from mere compensation for labor. So the 16th Amendment does not authorize a direct tax on the wages of individuals, but an excise or indirect tax on income derived from certain privileged activities, like the limited liability enjoyed by corporations. So how does the tax come to be applied to individual Americans against their natural rights? The answer is we contract into it by accepting a Social Security number. And then we reinforce that contract by voluntarily filing an IRS Form 1040 and electing to have our wages taxed. Why have our leaders allowed us to be duped by this fraud? The answer lies with the Federal Reserve and its influence on our elected officials. In 1967, Congressman Wright Patman, then chairman of the House Banking Committee, put it like this on the floor of Congress. He said, "In the United States today, we have in effect two governments. We have the duly constituted government, then we have an independent, uncontrolled, and uncoordinated government in the Federal Reserve System, operating the money powers which are reserved to Congress by the Constitution." Furthermore, despite repeated attempts by Congressman Patman and others, the Federal Reserve System has never been publicly audited. Who in the world could hold enough power to thwart 80 years of attempted legitimate audits by members of the United States Congress? Let's see. First, note that the Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. It is a private corporation. Call any Federal Reserve branch and they'll proudly tell you themselves. A look at some of the Fed's founders will give us some additional insight into its power. They include J.P. Morgan, the M.A. Rothschild Company, and Paul Warburg, among others. It is worth noting that the Rothschild family was also instrumental in creating the first and second national banks of the United States. The charter of the first one was vetoed by James Madison. The second one was abolished by President Andrew Jackson. The third one escaped from the lawful bounds of the Constitution and arrogantly walks among us today in its constant search for ignorant and unsuspecting prey. Back in the 18th century, here's what Baron M.A. Rothschild had to say about controlling our money supply. He said, "Give me control over a nation's currency, and I care not who makes the laws." Paul Warburg, a German-born financier who immigrated to the United States in 1907, was appointed to directorship at the New York Federal Reserve Bank by President Wilson in 1914. Although he wasn't even naturalized until 1916, Warburg literally masterminded the birth of the Federal Reserve System. He ran the bank behind the scenes until shortly before the end of World War I, when the press revealed that his brother Max was running Germany's Warburg Bank under Kaiser Wilhelm II. John Pierpont Morgan, another founder of the Fed and early America's own robber baron, is believed to have used his great wealth to engineer the devastating financial panic of 1907. Morgan, Warburg, Rothschild, and their successors have gotten away with this fraud for more than 80 years, ever since 1913, when Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. In that same year, former Senator and Secretary of State Philander Chase Knox announced that enough states had voted in favor of the proposed 16th Amendment to allow it to be adopted as part of the Constitution. In the mid-1980s, two patriotic Americans, Red Beckman and Bill Benson, traveled the country and examined documents relating to the ratification of the proposed 16th Amendment in each of the 48 states existing in 1913. The authors have documented their shocking findings in the two-volume book, The Law That Never Was, that the measure was never properly ratified by a constitutionally required 3/4 of the states. The false 16th is not an amendment to our organic law. The United States Supreme Court has thus far refused to consider the mountain of verified evidence Benson has accumulated, saying the adoption of the 16th Amendment is a political issue. Between the years 1913 and 1915, fewer than 2 million Americans volunteered to file income tax returns. Back then, they knew it was a tax only on corporations and certain licensed professions. The next income tax the American people were asked to volunteer for was the withholding or victory tax levied during World War II. The central bankers, with a lot of help from the Congress, used the patriotism of the American people to further enslave them. And of course, the victory tax was never allowed to die its natural death after World War II. So by 1946, the bankers had their hands deep in the pockets of individual Americans by withholding directly from their paychecks by using the war as a pretext. Despite this, it should be understood that no matter what statutes, codes, or regulations the federal government creates, it has no authority to impose a direct tax on individual Americans unless we give it individual permission by some color of contract or if we are under some form of martial law. The money interests know this and have engineered the federal income tax system based on voluntary compliance. Take a look at this statement from the cover of the IRS's Confidential Handbook for Special Agents. It reads, "Agents, our tax system is based on individual self-assessment and voluntary compliance. The material contained in this handbook is confidential in character. It must not, under any circumstances, be made available to persons outside the service." Why the secrecy? It's because the income tax is a fraud. All the wealth the IRS collects from the American people, which amounts to nearly $1 trillion every year, goes directly into the Federal Reserve banks, bypassing the U.S. Treasury and the lawful authority of Congress. Proof of this can be found in the back of any canceled check to the IRS, where it is stated that your money is being deposited in payment of U.S. obligation. That means U.S. debt. Now that the Fed has our country in a stranglehold of such immense debt, all our income tax dollars are deposited directly as payment on that debt, with compounded fraudulent interest. In a word, usury. The White House Budget Office recently invented a new methodology called generational accounting, which predicts a 71% tax load on future generations, shedding new light on the true meaning of a progressive income tax. Meanwhile, the IRS is busy sharing your tax information with foreign governments, among which are included the state in which you live. You are informed of this in Notice 609 and in the sections on the Privacy Act and the Paperwork Reduction Act of the IRS Form 1040. The deceit of the Federal Reserve and the fraudulent tactics of the IRS constitute just part of the complex puzzle created to rob us of our rights and wealth. That puzzle also involves the legal and jurisdictional status of the United States itself and our status as citizens of the 50 sovereign states of the Union. The United States, the author of the income tax, is not a country, but a corporation created by Congress. Your state is a country by law, and your original citizenship is of that country. The Supreme Court has confirmed that the term United States has 3 distinct legal meanings. In the 1945 case of Hooven and Allison Company versus Evatt, the court ruled that the term United States may be used in any one of several senses. It may be merely the name of a sovereign occupying the position analogous to that of other sovereigns in the family of nations. It may designate the territory over which the sovereignty of the United States extends, or it may be the collective name of the states which are united by and under the Constitution. Our founders identified themselves first and foremost as citizens of their respective states. Chief Justice John Marshall once said, "No political dreamer was ever wild enough to think about breaking down the lines which separate the states, and of compounding the American people in one common mass. Of consequence, when they act in their states." The framers did not intend that the new government have any jurisdiction or powers over the states or their citizens that were not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. They provided this limitation in the same constitutional clause which has been perverted by amendment to allow Congress to convert state citizens into federal subjects. Which leads us to another piece of the puzzle, the so-called 14th Amendment to the Constitution, reported as adopted in 1868. It was adopted by Congress, but never lawfully ratified by the states. 3 years after the end of the Civil War, Congress imposed martial law in the South during peacetime through the Reconstruction Act. Under the act, no citizen of a former Confederate state could vote or hold office unless they voted to adopt the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment granted the former slaves federal citizenship. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This was not a good deal, and it was eventually used to enslave all of the people. The deceit is in the wording of both the so-called 13th and 14th Amendments. Note, for instance, how the 13th Amendment provides that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. But why the emphasis on involuntary servitude? Isn't it a kind of slavery? Sure it is. But the drafters had to mention the concept of involuntary servitude because they wished to retain another type of slavery, voluntary servitude, economic slavery. Voluntary servitude is an ancient and established concept. It was the way serfs became subjects to their lords during feudal times in England and other European countries. It was a way for freemen to earn a living at a time when all property was held by a select few, and thus anyone who wanted to farm and support their families had first to agree to be subject to the lord of the land. Our forefathers hated this concept and designed our Constitution to exclude titles of nobility, making all Americans sovereign, but sovereigns without subjects. That is to say, equals among equals, peers at law. The fraudulent 14th Amendment turned the intention of the founders on its ear by making voluntary servitude a requirement for former slaves to gain any of the rights already granted to free-born state citizens. Congress basically told the former slaves they were free to leave, but if they stayed, their rights would derive from their status as subjects of the United States. The 14th Amendment was written ostensibly to provide the former slaves with the same fundamental rights as free-born state citizens, but only if they agreed first to become subject to the jurisdiction of the corporate United States, not the sovereign United States as viewed from abroad, and not these United States of America, but the United States, a singular municipal corporation that should only govern the District of Columbia and its territories, possessions, and enclaves. The sad tragedy in America today is that most Americans, regardless of race or birth, are now considered 14th Amendment slaves due to adhesion contracts with the government of the United States. Contracts such as Social Security, birth certificates, driving licenses, tax forms, and many other documents we normally don't think of as contracts. The true paramount citizenship that all Americans, regardless of color or religion, deserve is that of their respective states, which is a free and sovereign citizenship. Such a status exempts them from federal and state income taxes and inheritance taxes, as these forms of taxation violate the restrictions on government plainly stated in the national and various state constitutions. So what can be taxed to support the federal government? See the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and even if some great emergency required that the government raise revenue directly from all Americans, it can do so if the tax is apportioned in accordance with the Constitution. But the last time a direct tax was properly apportioned was at the start of the Civil War era, on August 5th, 1861. Now, if you're still thinking that the U.S. government needs to have a central bank and collect an income tax, or it will collapse, think again. Today, over 2/3 of the federal government's income is derived from sources other than the income tax. There is even evidence to suggest that none of your income tax is used for any government services. In a shocking expose of gigantic federal government waste, J. Peter Grace, chairman of President Reagan's Survey on Cost Control, stated in his book Burning Money that all of our personal income taxes are not enough to pay for the federal share of income transfer payments, like Social Security, and interest on the national debt. To fund the budget, the government uses lawful taxes, fees, excise taxes, tariffs, and other forms of income that have easily supported the federal budget in the past and could easily support it now. That is, without crushing interest payments on a fraudulent debt to ultra-rich foreign stockholders. We have done without a national bank for large stretches of our history, and the U.S. Treasury is perfectly capable of coining and managing an honest and lawful supply of commodity money. In fact, the only money sanctioned by the Constitution is gold or silver coin. This is a far more stable medium of exchange and is the type of money the lawful U.S. Treasury was designed to handle. It has been collecting and managing lawful taxes, duties, imposts, and excises since 1787. The government was doing so well collecting real commodity money under these original laws that it had amassed a huge surplus by the time this cartoon was penned 100 years later in 1887. Up to this point, we have shown you how the special money interests have established the Federal Reserve System, exploited a second class of citizens, defined by the unlawful 14th Amendment for other purposes, and mentioned a few of the names involved in the creation of the Fed. But there are other organizations working for our economic enslavement. One of the most frightening is supported by the American taxpayers themselves. It is called FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It was established by Executive Order 12148 and signed into existence by President Jimmy Carter in 1978. It was originally billed as an umbrella organization to administer emergency relief in the event of a natural disaster, war, or national crisis. But its true purpose lies in carrying out a series of executive orders if the president declares a national emergency, which has never been defined and which could be called in the event of a national financial crisis, such as occurred when the Fed tightened the money supply to create the Great Depression. Executive Order 10995 provides for seizure of all communications media in the United States. 10997 provides for seizure of all electric power, fuels, and minerals, both public and private. 10998 provides for seizure of all food supplies and resources, public and private, all farms and farm equipment. 10999 provides for seizure of all means of transportation, including personal cars, trucks, or vehicles of any kind, and total control over all highways, seaports, and waterways. And Executive Order 11,000 provides for seizure of all American people for workforces under federal supervision, including splitting up of families if the government has to. And Executive Order 11051 provides the Office of Emergency Planning complete authorization to put the above orders into effect in times of increased international tension or economic or financial crisis. Get the picture? Any national banking or currency collapse could put FEMA into action as a national police force under martial law conditions. This very scenario was being planned by former Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North in the basement of the Reagan White House in a plan called Rex 84. North's plan was to suspend the Constitution and establish holding camps for protesters in the event of civil unrest if the United States invaded Nicaragua. The discussion of this plan came up during the Iran-Contra hearings, but was quickly gavelled down by the chairman and moved to closed-door session away from public scrutiny. The same groups who helped devise FEMA have created a global movement to centralize economic power in various puppet organizations that preach peace and stability through some variation of socialism, but act aggressively to draw nations into a web of foreign debt and servitude to their own agendas. The United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Trilateral Commission, Bilderbergers, and Council on Foreign Relations all are committed to agendas of world domination through manipulation and monopoly of economic power. The Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, openly admits to being a private club, yet it is the primary recruiting post for international banking and for the federal government of the United States. Richard Nixon, Nelson Rockefeller, John Foster Dulles, Dean Rusk, Alger Hiss, and every president since FDR, with the exception of Ronald Reagan, have been members of this exclusive club, where super financiers and your elected representatives can mix freely and plan the next step in the consolidation of power in a new world order. It's a new world order the money interests have been trying to impose on us for generations. But how is it, given the rights and powers available in the Constitution and elsewhere, that all Americans have come to be trapped in this economic bondage? The special money interests have used the complexities of our laws and our own patriotism against us. For instance, one of the first contracts we sign with the government is our application for a Social Security number, the SS5 form. Most Americans are under the impression that it is mandatory to have a Social Security number to be employed under the laws of this country. But even though you were probably never informed of this, the Social Security Act is, like the income tax, entirely voluntary. Entirely voluntary. Take a look at this letter from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It states that Social Security is a voluntary system in that no one is required to get a number. But we do get a number because they never inform us that it is voluntary, and to obtain a number, you have to sign their contract. It's called an adhesion contract. That means you can't change it. You either sign it or you don't. And because we or our employers have been misled into thinking we are required to have a Social Security number to work, we signed. But in signing, we also declared ourselves to be subject to the laws and regulations of the corporate United States, the federal zone. We declared ourselves second-class citizens, 14th Amendment subject citizens, without even knowing it. And most of us did it before we were 18 years old. In that instant, we gave up our individual sovereignty without even having been informed we were doing so. Take a look at this letter from the Commissioner of Social Security. He says that the Social Security Administration has no authority to require an employer to provide or deny employment or services to anyone who refuses to disclose his or her number. This is a matter between the individual and the employer. We further establish ourselves as second-class citizens when we sign an IRS W-4 withholding allowance form, or the 1040 form itself. And there are numerous other adhesion contracts that we have been misled into signing. Were you ever informed of what you were signing away? Probably not. Fortunately, contract law provides the full terms of any contract or agreement must be disclosed in advance. And any time the terms of a contract are not disclosed to the person signing, it can be construed as an unconscionable contract and declared null and void from its inception by either party under the law. Hidden in the shadowy complexity of the IRS's limited authority are some of the facts which you need in order to rid yourself of the fear of it. Those facts are embedded in the thousands of pages that comprise Title 26 of the United States Code, the Internal Revenue Code. And understanding them is dependent upon understanding the special definitions for terms that are used in that code. Its text was written to be closed to the public. It is self-defining. But the code has now been cracked. The major elements have been identified and put together to help you regain your rights, your wealth, and your power. Besides your local library, there are dozens of constitutional research organizations and state citizenship foundations from coast to coast. When you are comfortable about where you stand, you will want to revoke your Social Security application and then rescind your signatures on all prior income tax returns, especially the first one. Then close existing bank accounts and open new accounts using properly executed W-8 foreign status certificates, or place you and your business under the protection of various types of trusts. In this way, you can remain out of the system and still control a bank account and conduct a business. Since federal regulations require all banks to be members of the Federal Reserve System, signature cards are just one way of enrolling you in their system and subjecting you to their jurisdiction. Another step to regain your individual sovereignty is to demand that the IRS prove their jurisdiction in writing and signed under penalty of perjury as required by IRC Section 6065. This demand is made under authority of the Freedom of Information Act, Title V, Section 552A. This will most often bring you a computerized response from the IRS stating as follows: based on the information you have provided, the account specified above is resolved. We may contact you in the future if further issues arise requiring clarification. At present, no further response is needed on the above account. But remember, there is no silver bullet. You must be prepared to defend your position. The best way to begin the study is to assert your sovereign citizenship of the state in which you live, instead of maintaining the false status of a 14th Amendment citizen of the United States. You see, what may still connect you to the corporate United States are any privileges you are getting. Privileges incur liabilities. Fundamental rights are inalienable. Many books and tapes are available to help you understand and assert your rights. Start asking questions. Start now. If you can't do your own research, then learn how to verify and test the things you hear. Watch out for self-styled gurus who can lead you into trouble, but not out of it. Yes, it is true that the present government is operating outside the very law that is its only authority to exist. But it also has the banks, courts, judges, armed agents, and the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. This is not a government to be approached in ignorance or without preparation. It has become arrogant and familiar with power. It may not want to relinquish that power just because it is in the wrong. In time, you will have all the lawful power and tools you need to act in the mode and character of a sovereign citizen. Then you can share your knowledge with others and help all Americans to regain our freedom and our country. What you ultimately do is, of course, your choice. But remember, at stake is your future and the future of your children. In the words of Johann von Goethe, from more than 200 years ago, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free.